When my daughter was born premature, my in-laws refused to help with the NICU bills. "She's too weak to survive anyway. Why waste money?" my mother-in-law said. My husband stayed silent on that phone call. I hung up, sold my wedding ring that night, and walked into the hospital alone. Years later, the same family that left me to drown came back begging me for help, and what I did next, they never saw coming. My name is Saoirse, and before I tell you what happened to the people who abandoned my daughter in her weakest hour, I need you to understand what those first 90 days felt like, because I don't think I'll ever be able to explain it any other way than this. It felt like drowning in a hospital hallway while everyone who was supposed to hold my head above water watched from the shore. I was 26 weeks pregnant when my water broke on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 3 months before my due date. While I was folding tiny onesies I had washed twice already because I couldn't stop touching them. My husband, Callister, drove me to the hospital with his hands shaking so hard on the steering wheel that he ran a red light. I remember thinking, in the middle of my own panic, that at least he was scared for the right reasons. I didn't know yet that being scared and being present are two completely different things. Everly was born at 1 pound 11 ounces. She fit in the palm of my hand. The neonatologist used the word critical so many times in the first conversation that it stopped sounding like a word and started sounding like a warning bell. She had underdeveloped lungs, a heart murmur they needed to monitor, and skin so thin I could see the blue veins mapping her tiny chest like a river system. They put her in an incubator with tubes running into her nose, her arm, the top of her foot because her veins kept collapsing. I wasn't allowed to hold her for 11 days. I could only reach through 2 small holes in the incubator and rest 2 fingers against her palm, and even that felt like it might break her. I knew the bills were coming before I even left the hospital parking lot that first time. NICU care isn't measured in days, it's measured in tens of thousands of dollars per week, and my insurance, which I had fought for during a difficult pregnancy while also working part-time as a payroll coordinator, covered only a portion of the cost, and disputed charges kept piling up faster than I could track them. Callister worked at a mid-sized logistics company as a warehouse supervisor, decent pay, nothing that could absorb a bill that would eventually climb past $200,000. So we did what people do. We called family. I want to be fair here, because I've told this story enough times now to know that people always assume the worst about everyone involved before they even hear the details, so let me be precise. My own parents were retired, living on a fixed income in another state, and they sent what they could, which wasn't much, but they called every single day, and my mother flew out for 2 weeks to sit with me in that NICU waiting room, even though her knees made the hospital chair's agony for her. That mattered. I want that on the record. Callister's parents were a different story. His father, Wendell, had built a small but comfortable insurance brokerage over 30 years. His mother, Harriet, had never worked outside the home a day in her life and had very particular opinions about what a strong family looked like, opinions she shared freely and often, usually at my expense, always with a smile that made the insult land softer and cut deeper at the same time. I had spent 6 years of marriage learning to nod through Harriet's comments about my cooking, my clothes, the fact that I kept my own last name professionally. I had learned that the way to survive Sunday dinners was to let things go. I could not let this go. Callister called them from the hospital hallway, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, machines beeping steadily from Everly's room down the corridor. I stood next to him because I needed to hear it directly, not filtered through his retelling later. He explained the situation calmly. The bills, the weeks ahead, the fact that we needed help. Real help, not vague encouragement. There was a pause on the line. Then Harriet's voice, clear enough that I heard every word without needing to lean in. "She's too weak to survive anyway. Why waste the money?" I felt my whole body go cold in a way that had nothing to do with hospital air conditioning. I waited for Callister to say something. To defend his daughter. To hang up on his own mother. To do anything at all. He stayed silent. Not shocked silent. Not the kind of silence that comes right before someone finds their words. Just silent. Compliant. The kind of silence that told me everything about where his loyalty actually lived, and it wasn't in that hospital hallway with me and our daughter fighting for her life 11 feet away. Wendell's voice came on next, gentler than Harriet's, but not gentle enough. He said maybe once she's more stable, they could revisit it. He said money was tight on their end too, which I later learned was a lie, because 6 weeks after that phone call, Harriet posted photos from a resort in the Turks and Caicos with a caption about how blessed she felt. I took the phone from Callister's hand. I didn't yell. I want people to understand that. I've seen enough of these stories to know the version people expect, the screaming, the dramatic hang-up. That's not what happened. I said, very quietly, "You will never speak about my daughter that way again," and I ended the call. Then I went into the bathroom down the hall, sat on the closed toilet lid, and cried in a way I had never cried before, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere lower than your chest, somewhere closer to your spine. That night, after Callister had gone home to shower and change, promising he'd be back in a few hours, I sat alone next to Everly's incubator, and I made a decision. I took off my wedding ring, a modest half-carat diamond that had felt like the whole world to me 4 years earlier, and I looked at it under the dim hospital light. It wasn't going to save my marriage from what I already sensed cracking underneath it, but it could buy 3 more days of care for my daughter. I found a 24-hour pawn and gold buying shop 9 minutes from the hospital, the kind of place with bars on the windows and a bell that jingled too cheerfully for what it was. The man behind the counter barely looked up as he weighed it, tested it, and offered me $1,100. I took it without negotiating. I walked back to that hospital alone in the dark, past a closed pharmacy and a bus stop with no one waiting at it, and I handed that money toward Everly's next round of bills the following morning. I want to tell you that Callister noticed the ring was gone right away. He didn't. It took him 4 days. The weeks that followed blur together in my memory, the way exhaustion blurs everything, but certain moments stayed sharp. The night Everly's oxygen levels dropped and 3 nurses moved so fast around her incubator that I had to be walked out of the room, my legs not fully working, a resident holding my elbow the whole time. The morning I finally got to hold her against my bare chest for skin-to-skin contact, her whole body smaller than my 2 hands cupped together, her heartbeat so fast and so determined that I promised her, silently, that I would spend the rest of my life making sure the world deserved her. The day I opened a hospital finance office letter that itemized a single week's charges at $18,400, and I sat in my car in the parking garage and did math I didn't have the energy to do, moving numbers between accounts that were already nearly empty. Callister worked overtime, I'll give him that. He wasn't a villain in the cartoonish sense. He was something harder to explain and harder to forgive, a man who loved his daughter in theory but couldn't locate his backbone when his mother was on the other end of a phone call. Every time I brought up Harriet's comment, he'd say some version of, "That's just how she talks," or "She didn't mean it literally," as if the literal meaning was the only thing that mattered, as if I hadn't heard the coldness underneath the words, the calculation, the decision that my daughter's life wasn't worth their money. His parents never called to check on Everly. Not once during those 91 days. Not a card, not a text, not a single question about whether she'd gained weight, whether her lungs had strengthened, whether she'd come off the ventilator. My own mother called every single evening, sometimes just to sit on the phone in silence with me because she knew I didn't have words left, and that silence from her felt like an entirely different language than the silence from Callister's side. There was a night in week 5 that I still think about more than almost any other. Everly had a setback, a minor infection that sent her oxygen requirements climbing again. Nothing catastrophic in the end, but terrifying in the moment, the kind of terrifying that makes a parent bargain with a god she hasn't spoken to since childhood. I called Callister at 11 at night, my voice cracking apart mid-sentence, and he always came when I called directly. I want to be fair about that. But when I asked him afterward, sitting in the family room down the hall with vending machine coffee going cold in our hands, whether he'd told his parents what had happened, he said he didn't want to worry them. I remember staring at him, at this man who had watched our daughter's oxygen monitor scream its alarm an hour earlier, and understanding that his instinct to protect his parents from worry ran deeper than his instinct to ask them for help. That was the moment, if I'm honest, when something in me quietly finished breaking, even though the actual ending was still months away. I went into survival mode in a way I don't think I fully processed until much later. I picked up freelance bookkeeping work on my phone in the hospital cafeteria between visiting hours, invoicing clients at 2 in the morning because it was the only quiet window I had. I sold things, the ring first, then a set of vintage china my grandmother had left me, then a watch Callister had given me for our anniversary that I told myself didn't mean what I thought it meant anymore. I learned the exact hours the hospital billing office was least busy so I could negotiate payment plans without waiting 40 minutes on hold. Everly turned a corner in her 7th week. Her lungs strengthened. She started tolerating small feedings without her oxygen dropping. The neonatologist, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Okonkwo, who I will be grateful to for the rest of my life, told me one afternoon that Everly was a fighter, and I remember laughing, a strange broken laugh, because of course she was. She came from me. We brought her home at 91 days old, weighing 5 pounds, 3 ounces, small enough that her going-home outfit, a preemie-sized onesie, still swallowed her whole. I remember standing in the hospital lobby with her in the car seat, Callister carrying the bag of hospital paperwork and monitoring equipment we'd need for the following months, and feeling something I can only describe as a strange, hollow victory. We had survived. But I already knew standing there that we didn't mean what it used to. Harriet and Wendell showed up exactly once during Everly's first year, at a family gathering I didn't want to attend but Callister guilted me into for the sake of keeping peace. Harriet held Everly for exactly 4 minutes, took 2 photos for her own social media, and spent the rest of the visit talking about a cruise she and Wendell were planning. She never asked how the hospital stay had gone. Never asked what it cost us, financially or otherwise. It was as if those 91 days had happened to strangers. I stopped attending family gatherings after that. Callister went alone, or didn't go, depending on how much energy he had left to negotiate that particular battlefield. Our marriage during that first year existed in a strange holding pattern, not actively falling apart, but hollowed out, like a house that still stands but has termites working quietly through the walls. The real ending came 18 months after Everly was born, on an ordinary Thursday. I had asked Callister calmly, for what felt like the 100th time, to set a boundary with his mother, not even to cut her off, just to tell her that comments about our daughter's worth were not acceptable. He told me I was still holding on to something that happened a long time ago, and that I needed to let it go for the sake of the family. Something in me went very quiet and very clear in that moment. I looked at this man I had married, who I had once believed would stand between me and anything that threatened our family, and I understood, fully and finally, that he had already chosen a side back in that hospital hallway, and it wasn't mine. What settled it completely happened 3 weeks later. I found out, almost by accident, that Wendell had quietly given Callister $4,000 toward a used truck he'd been wanting, money handed over the same month. I was still splitting Everly's specialist follow-up appointments across 2 credit cards because I couldn't cover them outright. When I asked him about it, he didn't deny it. He said his father had offered, and he hadn't wanted to make things complicated by mentioning it to me. I understood then that this wasn't really about money, and it never had been. His family had decided, long before I ever entered the picture, which parts of this family were worth investing in, and my daughter simply hadn't made that list. I filed for divorce 4 months later. It wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming match, no throne plates. I simply stopped waiting for him to become someone he had already shown me he wasn't. Callister didn't fight the divorce much, which told me something too, that some part of him had been waiting for permission to stop pretending as well. My own parents helped where they could, but they were older, on fixed incomes, and I refused to let myself become a burden they couldn't carry. I moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment with Everly, took on a full-time bookkeeping position with actual benefits, and kept the freelance clients on the side for the months when childcare costs outpaced my paycheck. There were years, I won't pretend otherwise, where I ate cereal for dinner 3 nights a week so Everly could have proper meals, where I sewed patches onto her secondhand coat sleeves rather than buying new ones, where I sat in my car outside her preschool crying quietly before wiping my face and walking in with a smile because she needed to see steady, not shattered. I remember one particular winter, Everly was almost 3, when our apartment's heating unit broke and the landlord took 11 days to fix it. I layered every blanket we owned onto her toddler bed and slept beside her most of those nights just to share body heat, telling her it was a camping adventure, so she wouldn't feel the fear I felt watching my breath fog in our own living room. I called an emergency repair line myself the 4th day because I couldn't wait any longer, paid for it out of money meant for something else, and figured out the something else later, the way I figured out almost everything during those years, sideways, creatively exhausted, but always figured out. I built a life for us with my own 2 hands, brick by brick, invoice by invoice. I went back to school part-time to finish the accounting degree I'd abandoned in my 20s, studying after Everly went to sleep, falling asleep with textbooks still open on my chest more nights than I could count. Once I finally completed the degree, I sat for my CPA exam and passed on my first attempt, and I remember calling my mother first, before anyone else, and both of us crying on the phone over a piece of news that had nothing to do with hospitals for once. Not long after, I was promoted to senior accountant at a firm downtown. A couple of years later, I started my own small bookkeeping and tax practice, working with local business owners who valued someone thorough and honest over someone flashy. Building that practice from nothing meant 18-hour days for the first year, meant Everly doing homework on a folding table in the corner of a rented office space because I couldn't yet afford both childcare and rent, meant turning down client after client until I finally had enough of a foundation to be selective instead of desperate. I remember the first time I hired an employee, a quiet, sharp young woman named Odalise who just finished her own accounting degree, and how strange and wonderful it felt to sign someone else's paycheck after years of barely covering my own. Everly grew into a bright, curious, fiercely independent girl who loved dinosaurs, then space, then competitive swimming, in that order, the way children's obsessions shift like seasons. She never needed a follow-up surgery, never showed lasting effects from her early arrival beyond a scar on her chest from an early procedure that she'd sometimes trace with her finger and ask about, and I'd tell her the truth in pieces appropriate to her age, that she came early, that she fought hard, that she was the strongest person I had ever known. I never told her when she was small about the phone call. Some things a child doesn't need to carry. Callister remained loosely in her life. Every other weekend visits that grew sparser over the years, birthday appearances, the occasional missed pickup with an apologetic text. He remarried 3 years after our divorce, to a woman I never had strong feelings about one way or the other. His parents, from what I understood through the thin threads of information that still reached me, remained exactly who they'd always been, only louder about it as they aged, the way people often do. I built my practice into something I was proud of. I bought a small house with a yard big enough for the dog Everly had begged for since she was 7. I paid off every dollar of debt those NICU months had left behind, slowly, methodically, the way I did everything now. And somewhere in there, without fully noticing the moment it happened, I stopped being the woman who cried in hospital bathrooms and became someone entirely new, someone steady, someone capable, someone who no longer flinched when a phone rang unexpectedly. Then, 10 years after that phone call in the hospital hallway, Wendell's insurance brokerage collapsed. I heard about it the way I heard most things about that family now secondhand, through Callister mentioning it during a pickup, his voice carefully neutral in the way people get when they're delivering news they suspect will land differently than they intend. A combination of bad investments, an aging client base that hadn't been replaced with new business, and apparently, some questionable bookkeeping practices Wendell had relied on for years, the kind of shortcuts that catch up to a business eventually. The brokerage folded within 8 months. Harriet and Wendell, both now in their late 60s, found themselves with a fraction of the retirement they'd planned around, a mortgage still owed on a house too large for 2 people, and medical costs of their own beginning to climb the way they do for everyone eventually, regardless of what they once said about other people's medical costs. I want to be honest about something here, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. I did not feel triumphant when I heard about the collapse of Wendell's brokerage. I felt mostly a strange stillness, the kind you feel when a storm you spent years bracing for finally passes, and you realize you're standing exactly where you were before, just older. There was no urge to call anyone and gloat, no fantasy of showing up at their downsized condo with a smile. Just a quiet, settled clarity about how far I'd come from the woman who once stood in that hospital hallway believing her worth, and her daughter's worth, could be measured by someone else's willingness to spend money on either of them. It was Harriet who called me directly, which surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire story. Not Callister relaying a message. Harriet herself, a number I hadn't seen in years, lighting up my phone on a Tuesday evening while I was helping Everly, now 10 years old, with a fraction worksheet at our kitchen table. I let it go to voicemail. She called again 20 minutes later. I let that go too. The third time, I stepped into my bedroom and answered. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered, though I recognized the same practiced warmth underneath it, the tone she'd always used right before asking for something. She talked about Wendell's health, about the brokerage, about how difficult things had become, and then, carefully, almost gently, she asked whether I might be able to help. Just a loan, she said. Just until things stabilized. Family helps family, she said, and I remember sitting very still on the edge of my bed, staring at a worksheet with fractions still open on the kitchen table where my daughter was waiting for me, and thinking about how precisely, how exactly, this moment mirrored the one 10 years earlier, just with the roles reversed. I told her I needed to think about it. That wasn't a delay tactic. I genuinely needed to sit with what I was feeling before I responded, because I didn't want to answer from anger, even though anger was certainly present. I wanted to answer from clarity. I thought about it for 3 days. I thought about the version of me who stood in that hospital hallway hearing my daughter's worth measured against a dollar amount. I thought about the wedding ring on that pawn shop counter, the man barely looking up as he weighed it. I thought about the nights of cereal for dinner, the patched coat sleeves, the years of building something from nothing while the people asking me now for help had vacationed in the Caribbean during the exact weeks my daughter fought for her life 11 feet down a hospital hallway. I called Harriet back on a Friday evening. I told her I would not be giving her or Wendell a loan. I told her, calmly, the same way I told her 10 years earlier that she would never speak about my daughter that way again, that some debts aren't measured in dollars, and theirs had come due a long time ago. I told her I hoped they found a way through their situation, and I meant that, genuinely, because I have never wished harm on anyone, even people who showed me exactly who they were when it mattered most. But I would not be the one funding it. She tried a different approach after that. Guilt, mostly, reminding me that Everly was her granddaughter too, as if that fact hadn't been irrelevant to her 10 years earlier when Everly weighed 1 pound, 11 ounces and needed every dollar she could get. I let her finish. Then I told her that Everly barely knew her, through no fault of Everly's own, and that this too was a consequence of choices Harriet had made long before I ever had the chance to make any in return. I ended the call the same way I'd ended the one 10 years before it. Quietly. Firmly. Without raising my voice once. I didn't tell Everly about any of this until 6 years later, when she was 16 and old enough to understand the full shape of it, sitting across from me at our kitchen table on an ordinary evening, the same table where the fraction worksheet had once sat. She asked, the way 16-year-olds eventually start asking harder questions, why she barely knew her paternal grandparents. I told her the truth, finally, in full. The phone call, the ring, the 91 days. I watched her face change as she absorbed it, watched something harden and something else soften in her at the same time, the particular alchemy of a child learning exactly how hard her mother had fought for her to exist in the world at all. She reached across the table and took my hand, and she said something I don't think I'll ever forget. You didn't need them. You just needed you. I told her that wasn't quite true. I needed a lot of people along the way, nurses and doctors and my own mother, and eventually good friends I'd built a life alongside. But I understood what she meant, and I let myself simply say thank you. She asked me, later that same evening, whether I regretted selling the ring. I told her the truth. I had thought about that ring more times over the years than I could count, not because I missed it, but because it had taught me something no comfortable life ever could have, that I was capable of surviving without any of the things I once believed I needed to survive at all. A marriage. A family's approval. A piece of jewelry that had once symbolized promises other people hadn't kept. I told her that letting go of that ring was the first time in my adult life I chose her, fully and without hesitation, over everything else, and that I would make the exact same choice again without a second of doubt. There's one more thing Everly said that night that I've carried with me ever since. She asked whether I thought Harriet had ever really believed what she said on that phone call, or whether it was just cruelty for its own sake. I told her I honestly didn't know, and that I'd stopped needing to know a long time ago, because the answer wouldn't have changed anything about what I did next. What mattered wasn't the why behind Harriet's words. What mattered was what I chose to do in the 91 days that followed them, and every day after that. She sat with that for a while, tracing the small scar on her chest the way she'd done since she was little, and then she asked if she could see a photo of me at the pawn shop counter, as if such a photo existed, as if that night had been documented anywhere except in my memory. I told her there was no photo, that some of the most important moments of a life happen in places no camera ever reaches, witnessed only by the person living through them and, eventually, told to the people who need to understand what it cost. Wendell and Harriet's financial situation, as far as I know now, eventually stabilized somewhat through the sale of their house and a much smaller condo, through Wendell taking on part-time consulting work well into his 70s, through the kind of quiet downsizing that comes to people who once assumed comfort was permanent. I don't know all the details because I stopped tracking their lives a long time ago. Callister reached out once more about a year after Harriet's call, asking whether I'd reconsider, framing it as being for his father's sake rather than his mother's, as if that distinction changed anything about what had happened in that hallway 10 years earlier. I told him the same thing I'd told Harriet, and I also told him something I'd never said aloud before, that I had spent years waiting for him to apologize, not for staying silent on one phone call, but for every quiet choice afterward that told me his parents' comfort would always outweigh his daughter's well-being in some invisible calculation he never seemed aware he was making. He didn't have an answer for that. I didn't need him to anymore. What strikes me most, looking back now, is how little the money ever actually mattered in the end, on either side of the story. It was never really about the wedding ring, or the pawn shop, or the $1,100 it bought toward a bill that eventually reached 6 figures. It was about the sentence itself. She's too weak to survive anyway. Why waste the money? And what that sentence revealed about which of us in that family were willing to fight for a life that couldn't yet fight fully for itself. I fought. My daughter fought harder than any 1 pound, 11-ounce person should ever have to. Everyone else simply revealed, in their own time, exactly how much fighting they had in them. My practice now employs 2 other accountants and a part-time office manager. Everly is 16 now, swims competitively, wants to study marine biology, and has never once doubted that she was worth every ounce of fight it took to get her here. I found my worth in a hospital hallway at 1 a.m, holding 2 fingers against my daughter's palm through a small plastic opening, promising her a life that no one's coldness could ever touch again. I kept that promise. That's the only ending that ever really mattered to me. If someone told your child's life wasn't worth saving, Would you have walked away from them the way I did, or would you have given them one more chance? This has been another story from Valira Payback. If this moved you, you know what to do, like share, and I'll see you in the next one.